The title of her Lawther lecture is Physical Activity and the Prevention of Chronic Disease. Dr. Lee.
As you can see, I'm fumbling here and looking for my pointer. I was told I need to stand up front because I'm too short and you can't see me behind the podium, so I'm going to stand up here. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm so delighted and honored to be giving the 2015 Lawther lecture. I'd like to thank the School of Health and Human Sciences and the RISE Network for inviting me to join you this year. I'm especially grateful to Dr. Kathy Ennis, who's been a wonderful host, and she has helped me with travel arrangements. It hasn't always been smooth, but I'm so pleased to be here today. As she said, I'm going to talk about physical activity for the prevention of chronic diseases. Now, when I came here, a lot of people asked me, so what's it like in Boston? Is there still snow? I thought I'd show you guys a couple of pictures. So this is from our local newspapers. This is a neighborhood in Boston called Jamaica Plain, and there's enough snow that this gentleman was able to build a 4-room igloo, complete with a bar. That's how much snow we got. And I'm proud of the bicycle sharing program we have in Boston. Boston is sometimes known as the Hub. It's a nickname for the city, and we have a program called the Hubway. It's a shared bicycle system. You pay with your credit card and you get a membership and you can take your bicycle from point A to point B and just leave it there. But as you know, in winter, we obviously didn't have it. So I thought, maybe we could do a different thing. We could have the sled way. We could borrow these Iditarod sleds and instead use them. So because of such a winter, I'm especially grateful to be here. This year, you have a beautiful spring, the redbuds are out, the flowers are out, there's green on the trees. I guess there's still hope for me. All right, I'm told that there's another event occurring here at 5, so I promise I'll get you out here promptly. What I'd like to do in the next 50 minutes or so is to talk about 3 topics. So I'm going to talk about what kills us. What are the diseases that we die from in the US? And I hope to be able to show you convincingly that if you're physically active, you can reduce your risk of developing many of these chronic diseases. Secondly, so we know physical activity will reduce your risk of developing these diseases. How much do we need to do? We have current guidelines from the US government, and we'll talk about what these guidelines are. Now, of course, humans being what they are, nobody goes up to say, oh, goody, goody, how much exercise do I need to do? What they tend to ask is, how little can I do and get away with? So the third thing I'm going to talk about is current research in this area that focuses at the lower end of the spectrum. If you do less than what's recommended, will you get health benefit? And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the top end of the spectrum. There's a small proportion of the population that does a lot of physical activity, and I think you might have seen in the newspapers in the last couple of months, a couple of studies showing that if you do physical activity at high levels, there might be potential harm. Is this indeed true? What do the studies tell us? So let's get started. What kills us in the US? You're not going to be able to see the details on this slide. All I wanted to show you is a few highlights, and I'll point those up to you. So this chart shows the leading causes of death in the US over the last century or so, from 1900 to 2010. The first thing I want you to note is you can see these are the death rates in 1900 down to 2010, and the death rate has obviously been going down. This is a major success of the public health system and the US medical system. In the 1900s, your life expectancy was 49 years of age. Over this period of time, life expectancy nowadays is 79 years of age. We live 30 years longer than we used to. Now, women do better than men. Sorry, guys. The women live a little bit longer and the men a little bit shorter. The next thing I want you to note is look at the causes of death. So again, you're not going to be able to see the details, but there are 2 colors I want to point out. The greeny shades and the purple and gray shades. At the beginning of the 1900s, you'll see that most of the bar was covered by the greeny shades. And the greeny shades are infectious diseases, things like influenza, respiratory infections. And in fact, if you can see this peak, You know about the influenza epidemic in 1918 to 1920 that killed between 50 to 100 million people worldwide. So at the beginning of the century, most people died from infectious diseases. As we come to today, you see that you hardly see any of the green. Now you see purple and you see gray. The purple is heart disease, cardiovascular disease, both coronary heart disease as well as stroke, and the gray is cancer. So of all the deaths that occur nowadays, 29% of them are caused by cardiovascular disease, and 23% of the deaths are caused by cancer. So today, more than half of all the deaths that occur in the US are due to these two chronic diseases, cardiovascular disease and cancer. And one of the things you can do to reduce your risk of developing these two major causes of death is to be physically active. If you look at the history of physical activity as medicine protecting you against these diseases, it's an interesting history. If we look at very ancient writings that go back to 2500 BC, you can find from ancient writings of Chinese physicians that they actually prescribed physical activity for their patients, who were primarily emperors and high-ranking people. Now, this certainly was not evidence-based medicine, but was based on the personal belief of these physicians. Hippocrates, around 400 BC, advocated physical activity as well. But it wasn't until the middle of the 1900s that we started having epidemiologic literature that showed, in an evidence-based fashion with appropriate control groups, that physical activity was effective in decreasing the risk of many chronic diseases. In fact, one of the panelists at lunch session today talked about people being in hospital after a heart attack. Some of you may have parents or grandparents who are old enough that you'll remember. If you had a heart attack in the early 1900s or the mid-1900s, they put you in hospital and you stayed in bed for 1 month. Nobody wanted you to move. Nowadays, if you have bypass surgery, even as your chest is really painful, the nurse is shoving you out of bed to sit and to walk the very next day. And the reason this has changed is because a large body of literature over the last half century, 50 to 60 years, that has clearly shown us that physically active individuals have lower rates of many chronic diseases. I wanted to honor my mentor, Professor Ralph Paffenbarger here. Professor Paffenbarger, together with Professor Jeremy Morris in England, were the two pioneers of physical activity epidemiology. They started some of the early studies showing us why you should be physically active if you want to reduce your risk of heart disease. Professor Morris looked at bus drivers who sat the whole day and London bus conductors who walked up and down the double-decker buses, and he showed that the drivers had twice the rates of heart disease compared to the bus conductors. Professor Ralph Paffenbarger started a study called the Harvard Alumni Health Study, looking at Harvard alumni, and the study continues still today. So Harvard alumni who are physically active have lower rates of many chronic diseases compared to those who are inactive. We don't have time to go into all the studies, but what I've done is summarize on this slide for you, showing you what physical activity is good for. If you're physically active, you have lower rates of death and a longer life compared to someone who is inactive. You have lower rates of heart disease, you have better blood pressure, you have lower rates of stroke, you have lower rates of metabolic syndrome, type 2 diabetes. You're also less likely to develop many types of cancer, particularly colorectal cancer and breast cancer. You have lower rates of depression, and you have lower rates of fractures. If you're someone who's physically active, you're also likely to have better fitness profile, better body composition, better bone structure, bone health, and you're less likely to suffer cognitive decline. Your functional health goes well into your old ages. So as my mentor, Professor Ralph Paffenbarger, said, everything that gets worse when you grow older gets better when you're physically active. Many of you will know that smoking is bad for your health, but I think it's not as common knowledge that on a worldwide basis, physical inactivity is as powerful a risk factor for mortality as smoking. So in 2012, a group of collaborators internationally, we published a series of articles in The Lancet, and came up with 2 different covers looking at physical inactivity throughout the world. how it's very common in many countries throughout the world, and trying to look at the impact of what it means that all these people are inactive. And the two headlines you see on this cover, we describe physical activity as being a pandemic. We've been good in reducing the rates of smoking throughout the world. Only a quarter of the world's population smokes, but 1/3 of the world's adult population is insufficiently physically active to meet recommendation, such that if you look at the smokers and the people who are physically inactive throughout the world, each risk factor results in approximately 5 million premature deaths each year throughout the world. So physical inactivity is as powerful a risk factor as smoking. And this is something that we try to emphasize to the public as well as to people who make policy, to help us understand and be educated about how important physical activity is for your health. So I say 1/3 of the world's population gets insufficient physical activity. How much physical activity should we get? So let's now look at current guidelines for physical activity. What do the guidelines tell us we need? In the US, our current guidelines, the comprehensive federal guidelines were made in 2008, and these guidelines were essentially adopted by the World Health Organization in 2010. So there are separate guidelines for children, for adults, and older adults. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to talk about adults aged between 18 and 64. What these guidelines tell us is that we need to get moderate intensity physical activity, such as brisk walking, 150 minutes each week. Or, if you prefer to exercise vigorously, to get 75 minutes, 1 hour, 15 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity, such as jogging each week. Or to do some combination of activities from these two intensities such that they expend the same amount of energy. And in addition, to do muscle strengthening exercises on 2 days of the week. Now, if you want to get even more benefits, the guidelines say do twice that amount. 300 minutes a week of moderate intensity physical activity, or 150 minutes of vigorous intensity physical activity, or some combination of the two that expends equivalent amount of energy as each of the regimens, as well as your 2 days a week of muscle strengthening exercises. The guidelines are very encouraging in the sense that they also say that if you cannot get to that level, do some amount of physical activity. Some is better than nothing. Now the implication is that some activity has to be at least moderate in intensity. So what is moderate intensity physical activity? That's the technical definition and that's the lay definition which the public will understand. The technical definition is moderate intensity physical activity requires an energy expenditure of 3 to less than 6 METs. And what is that? So a MET is the energy expended while sitting quietly. All of you are probably expending about 1 MET. I'm standing and pacing a little bit. I'm probably expending between 1.5 to 2 METs. If I were to walk very briskly, I might expend 4 or 5 METs. If I were to jog, I might expend 7 to 8 METs. A top marathon runner might be expending something at 20 to 25 METs while he's running. So try telling that to the public. They're going to look at you glassy-eyed, and all your messages about the benefits of physical activity are probably going to get lost. So we use the SING test. The SING test is an approximation of when you are working at a moderate intensity level. So if you're working at a moderate intensity level, you can feel your heart rate going up a little bit. You might start to sweat a little bit. You can still carry on a conversation, but you cannot sing. So if you find that you're singing the latest Beyonce song, you're not working hard enough. If you can't talk and you can't sing, you're exercising vigorously. If you can talk, you're not exercising at a high enough level to be moderate. Okay, so that's the definition of moderate intensity. So if we tell people you have to do moderate intensity physical activity, and these questions have been raised in the sessions we had throughout the day, what counts? In the past, we used to think of only exercise. You need to go out to run. You need to go out to swim. You need to go out to play tennis as counting. Now we are increasingly realizing that any energy that you expend counts, whether it's your leisure time, your occupation, whether you do it as part of transport, your household chores, they all count. So you could be walking your dog, you could be playing with your grandchildren, you could be gardening, you could be a neat freak and scrubbing your house. So that counts, so long as it passes the sing test. Now we say do it for 150 minutes a week, but we actually prefer you to break it up throughout the week rather than doing it all in 1 or 2 single spurts, because that's less likely to tax and strain your musculoskeletal system. And the duration of these activity bouts has to be at least 10 minutes in duration, so you can break it up in 10-minute bouts. So this is what the physical activity recommendations tell us. And I'm going to spend the rest of the time now talking about what is new in physical activity and chronic disease prevention, and talk about some of the research that I'm conducting as well. So we talked about there being a large body of evidence showing that physical activity can reduce the rates of many chronic diseases. And we know what the guidelines are telling us, what we need to do in terms of getting these health benefits. So current research is actually focused on the 2 ends of the spectrum, the less than what is recommended as well as the more than what is recommended. And I'm going to talk about these dose response questions. We're going to talk first about how little is too little, talking not only about intensities that are lower than moderate intensity, but the role of sedentary behavior. Is sitting bad for you? What if you're someone who's physically active but also sits a lot? What happens to you? And then we'll talk about the other end of the spectrum, how much activity is too much? Is there a level beyond which it's harmful or beyond which you no longer get any health benefits? So let's start by looking at how little activity is too little. I've printed this out from the current guidelines for physical activity. So you will see that it emphasizes the range of moderate intensity minutes a week. And we talked about what is currently recommended, 150 minutes at least a week. You get more benefits if you do 300 minutes a week. And it says if you do less than 150, you get some benefit. But the implication is that it has to be at least moderate intensity. So why is there no mention of light intensity physical activity? Is it that it isn't helpful to you? Well, to understand the recommendations, you need to look a little bit at how the guidelines were developed. So I was privileged to serve on this guidelines advisory committee. And what we were charged with was to look at the relationship between physical activity and the risk of developing clinical endpoints, or actual diseases itself. And why was the emphasis on that? That's because if you have high blood pressure, not everyone with high blood pressure ends up with a stroke. Not everyone with high blood pressure ends up with heart disease. So the panel wanted to look at the most severe outcomes, if you will. And so the panel focused on studies that looked at physical activity and its relation to developing long-term health outcomes. As you might imagine, the kinds of studies that were conducted to look at physical activity and the development of long-term health outcomes were all what we call observational epidemiologic studies. So you take a group of people, you find out about their physical activity patterns, and you follow them up over time for the development of these diseases. As you might expect, these studies all have to be very large. So even though heart disease and cancer are the leading causes of death, you still need large numbers of people. If you take 10 people and you follow them up for a year, at the end of the year, nobody may have developed heart disease, or one person may have developed heart disease, one person may have developed cancer. That's not very informative. It's not going to tell you very much about the relationship between physical activity and these diseases. So out of necessity, these studies have tended to be large studies, studies of thousands, tens of thousands, and maybe even hundreds of thousands of subjects. And if you think about trying to assess physical activity in these large groups of individuals, in the past, the most feasible way of doing this is by questionnaire, asking people about what they did, using the questionnaire that my mentors, Professor Ralph Affenbarger, developed. And these early investigators had found out that if you ask people about their physical activities, they tend to report higher intensity physical activity quite well, which makes a lot of sense. If I play tennis once a week, I can report accurately every Saturday I go out to play doubles tennis 2 hours a week. Or if I'm someone who goes for a walk after dinner every night, I can say I walk 7 days a week for 20 minutes after dinner. I can report that accurately. But if you were to ask me to report about the time I spent folding clothes, doing some light dusting around the house, washing dishes, I probably would report that very imprecisely. And so these early investigators found out that the way people reported light-intensity physical activity was really not great. And so they tended to focus on moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity, which is why the guidelines say we have to do moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. It's not that light intensity physical activity is not beneficial. It's because few studies have assessed light intensity physical activity well. Now this is all changed now because we now have technology that has become quite cheap. Those of you who have phones, smartphones, you have a little device called an accelerometer in these smartphones. And we all have gizmos that you see being sold. One of them is a Fitbit, Jawbone, Nike Fuel Band. All these things incorporate accelerometers. So what is an accelerometer? Accelerometers were first commercially marketed probably in the 1930s, and as its name suggests, it measures accelerations. And the first accelerometers were actually mounted on bridges, on helicopters, to be able to measure accelerations, because as you might imagine, you don't want your bridges to vibrate too much. So the early accelerometers were very clunky and they weighed about a pound. Nowadays, technology is advanced so much that we have accelerometers. So this is a quarter, and this is an accelerometer that I use in my study. It weighs less than an ounce. You can wear it on the wrist, or in our study, we have women wear it around their hips. And what do they tell you? So what it gives you are these tracings, and this is a tracing from someone who was wearing an accelerometer on the hip and at the same time wearing it on the wrist. And I don't know whether you can see clearly, but there are actually three colors: green, red, and blue. That's because these tracing are accelerations that measure your body movements in the up and down plane, the side to side plane, and the front to back plane. So you can measure movements fairly accurately. And it makes a difference whether you wear it on your hip or whether you wear it on the wrist. Most research methods are developed for it on the hip because it measures ambulatory activity well. It's interesting to see that if you put it on the hip, it doesn't capture all movements. So it corresponds for the most part. A lot of activity on the hip, a lot of activity on the wrist. And here the subject is probably sleeping, activity. Now this is interesting. This is on the hip. Not very much movement on the hip, but you can see a lot of things going on with the wrist. So what's actually happening? This is actually on one of my research assistants. So she came into work, she sat on her desk, and she was processing questionnaires. So she was scanning forms. Her wrist moved, but her hip didn't because she was sitting down. So when you see all this, it looks, okay, great, but what do you do with the data? So currently what we do is we reduce these data into a metric called counts per minute. And we look at the counts per minute at different times throughout the day. So let me try and walk you through this. So this is a tracing from one of the older women in our study. She is, I don't exactly remember this woman's age, but the average age of women in our study is 72 years old. So you can see that she was asleep, she woke up, she put on her accelerometer, and then you see these jiggling things throughout the day. And what we do is we set these thresholds. So this threshold is 100 counts per minute. At 100 counts per minute, below that, you're most likely sedentary. Even if you sat in the car and you jiggle with whatever the potholes, the counts are likely to be less than 100 counts per minute. And if you did light intensity activity, it would be below. NHANES, which is a national survey, uses the count level of 20 counts per minute. So you can see what's interesting about this woman is that she's an older woman, and we said that moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity is 20 counts per minute or higher. You can see that there are only 2 blips in the day where she did anything that met recommendations. And it probably wouldn't meet recommendations because this is only a single blip. And remember, we said that it needs to be in durations of 10 minutes or longer to count. So she's spending a lot of her time in light intensity physical activity. Is this not helpful to her? So this is what some of the current research studies are trying to find out. And you're beginning to see studies that have measured physical activity using objective devices And currently, the data that are available are from what we call cross-sectional studies, or a snapshot in time. So they get people to wear the accelerometers, and in many of these studies, there's a blood draw or physical exam. So you have the activity at this time, and at the same time, you have measures of their adiposity, their blood pressure perhaps, some of their blood work. And generally, you see favorable associations. But the problem with cross-sectional studies is it's a snapshot in time. You can't tell the directionality. So these data, do they mean women who do a lot of light-intensity physical activity have a better health profile? Or do they mean people, women and men with a better health profile are the ones who are healthy enough to do light-intensity physical activity? You can't tell the direction. So the cross-sectional studies merely tell you there's an association, but they can't tell you whether light intensity causes better health, or better health makes you able to do light intensity physical activity. But this is all going to, So I'm going to show you the findings from a single cross-sectional study. No need to look at all the details other than to see these red stars. These red stars are showing markers of body composition, glucose and insulin tolerance, measures of adiposity, certain inflammatory markers. They are all better among individuals who do more light intensity physical activity. But again, these are cross-sectional. So in the next few years, we're going to be able to see data from other studies. So I'm not going to talk a lot about these studies other than that there have been several studies mounted throughout the world. These are both US as well as European and including the United Kingdom studies. And these are studies that have gotten subjects in the thousands or tens of thousands to wear these devices, and these individuals are going to be followed up over the next period of time to see the onset of diseases among people with different levels of physical activity. And I've boxed this up because this is our study, the Women's Health Study. Currently, we've got more than 17,000 women. They were age 62 plus when they entered the study. Their average age is 72 years. Some of them are obviously much older than 62. And we'll get some data in a few years' time. So we've now talked about light intensity physical activity, and I'm going to move down the spectrum to even lower intensity physical activity, sedentary behavior. And if you've looked at the newspapers in the last, maybe 5 years or so, you'll see sporadically articles talking about how bad sedentary behavior is for your health. So this is from the New York Times, and it says that what's the most unhealthful thing you can do every day? And it proposes that sitting may be indeed very bad for your health. So let's look at the data and see what they tell us. Now we are starting to have a bunch of studies that have looked at sedentary behavior, either self-reported sitting, or many of the studies ask about self-reported TV time, time that you spend watching television. And I'm going to show you meta-analysis from several studies. So what are meta-analysis? Meta-analysis are simply combining the totality of evidence that exists. So these are the individual studies, and this is what we call a pooled result, or the meta-analysis, all the previous studies. So this is the mark 1. If a study has a dot that falls on 1, it simply means that the death rates of people who sit a lot is the same as the death rate of people who do not sit a lot. If you are more than 1, it suggests that the death rate among people who sit a lot is higher than the death rate of, people who do not sit a lot. So there's another thing I want to point out. So the dots tell you the single best estimate from the study. There's something that we calculate called a 95% confidence interval, and it looks like whiskers in the dot. So what is a 95% confidence interval? It tells you the certainty that you have in the result. That the 95% confidence will cover 95% of all simulated study results. So I guess in a layman's way, you would say you're 95% confidence that the true value lies somewhere in here. So if the whiskers are short, it means that you have quite a bit of confidence in the results. If the whiskers are long, it means less confidence because there's more statistical uncertainty in the result. So if you pull together all the findings, you'll see that for death rates, people who do a lot of sitting have on average about a 50% increased risk of dying compared to those who do not sit a lot. So this is just dying. Let's look at other outcomes. So this is cardiovascular disease, either the onset of cardiovascular disease or death from cardiovascular disease. And the pooled results across several studies suggest that if you sit a lot, you have between 2 and 2.5-fold risk of either developing or dying from cardiovascular disease compared to those who do not. And you see the same pattern for type 2 diabetes, about a 2-fold increase in result. So what if you are physically active but you also sit a lot? This sounds like an oxymoron, but it really isn't. Think about it. We do know that if you look at national survey data, people who are better educated tend to be the ones who exercise more than those who are less well educated. But the people who are better educated also tend to have white-collar jobs. So if you're a white-collar job, you tend to sit a lot. So indeed, you can be someone who sits a lot but who's physically active. And many of you probably fall in this category. You sit a lot in your job, but maybe several days a week you might go out for a 30-minute or 1-hour run. So you are both physically active and you are also a sedentary person. And some of the studies are asking the question, if you're someone who sits a lot, but you're physically active, does it cancel out the bad effect of sitting a lot? So these are some data from an AARP study that's sponsored by the NIH, and let's work through them. What it does is it asks people about their physical activity in the week, and these broad groups are people, I'm sorry, I keep hitting the wrong button, and these are broad categories of people according to their exercise patterns. So these mortality rates as a group among those who never or rarely exercise is much higher than those who exercise for more than 7 hours a week in moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity. But within each of these levels of exercise, you also have categories of people who view TV. So in this group alone, this group of people views less than 1 hour of television a day. This group of people views 7+ hours of television a day. So within each strata of physical activity, you see this graded response. Everybody is physically active, but among those who are physically active at this level, those who watch a lot of TV have higher death rates compared to those who watch little TV. But the interesting thing is, okay, so you're very sedentary, but you also exercise a lot. So this person, you're very active, but you also watch a lot of TV. Compare that to the person who doesn't do any physical activity or rarely does physical activity, but doesn't watch TV as well. And if you look at the height of the bars, they are almost the same. So this particular study suggests that if you're physically active, but you sit a lot, it doesn't protect you against the bad effects of sedentary physical activity. But this is only one study. The data are actually quite mixed at the moment, and we're not quite sure. So what are some of the problems with the study? So we had a student session earlier, and we talked about alternate explanations for studies. Very often, if you listen to the media, you'll hear headlines, but you need to look at the details of the study. And the details of the studies that have been conducted make us place a little bit less confidence in these results, because all of these studies relied on self-reports of sitting, and many of them were not totality of sitting, but self-reports of how much TV you watch a day. So 2 problems. If you ask people to self-report their sitting time, you find that it's not that well reported. If you ask people to watch their TV time, it's more accurately reported. But the problem is that if you're sitting while watching TV, you might also be doing some things. You might be snacking on Doritos. So the people who watch a lot of TV who also have shorter lifespans, is it because they sit a lot watching TV, or is it because they're eating a lot of Doritos? So you might collect information on diet, and you can control for perhaps some of these differences in diet, but the snacking behaviors may not be well controlled for. So stay tuned. We don't know for sure, and studies that are ongoing will tell us more about that. So just to summarize, how little activity is too little. So our current guidelines tell us to do moderate to vigorous intensity physical activity, and we should try to strive for 150 minutes a week, although if you can't do that, some is better than nothing. But it says nothing about light intensity physical activity, which older people are more likely to carry out. Not because the data say they aren't helpful, but because to date, we haven't had very good data on that. So ongoing studies that have better measures of light intensity physical activity will be able to tell us more in the coming years. There's also been a lot of interest in sedentary behavior, sitting too much. Is that harmful for you? What if you sit a lot but also exercise a lot? And again, the data are not very clear. And ongoing studies will tell us more in the coming, I expect, 3 to 5 years. So in the last bit of time, let's talk about how much activity is too much. So again, I printed this from the physical activity guidelines. And the physical activity guidelines acknowledge a dose response. So remember, we said 150 minutes a week is what you want to strive for. If you do 300 minutes a week, you'll get more health benefits. But they also acknowledge that current science does not allow researchers to identify an upper limit of activity about which there are no additional health benefits. So, do people who do high levels of physical activity have adverse health effects? And we certainly do see reports such as this. So this is an article that came out a couple of years ago in the New England Journal of Medicine, looking at half marathon and marathon runners. So these were 10.9 million runners over the period 2000 to 2010. And in this period of time, they looked at all these runners and documented cardiac arrest and death from cardiac arrest among these individuals. And they documented 59 cardiac arrests, 42 of which were fatal. So there are some deaths that occur during these events, but very rare. So if you count sudden deaths, it occurs at the rate of 1 for every 259,000 runners in these race events. Or if you want to count runner hours, it's 1 for every 714,000 runner hours. So that's one of the studies that came out. Another one that got a lot of press was a study out of Europe. It's looking at a very prestigious cross-country race called the, and I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, called the Vasaloppet race. It's a 90 kilometers, I think it's like 140 miles, cross-country race. Very, very arduous. And what they found was that among the skiers who took part in this race, if you did only one race, this was the cumulative risk of developing cardiac arrhythmias or abnormal heart rhythms. If you did 2 races, you developed it at a higher rate. If you did 3 to 4 races, even higher, and 5 or more races was the highest. So the cardiac arrhythmias were primarily what we call atrial fibrillation, which tends not to be fatal. There was no association between the number of races and ventricular arrhythmias, which would be fatal. So again, thinking about the data and not the headlines. So the headlines, of course, scream that high-intensity physical activity is bad for you. So there are 2 questions that would occur to me if I were to look at it. The first is that these are looking at deaths and arrhythmias among athletes. So the athletes died while they were running. The athletes who did more cross-country races had higher rates of heart abnormalities. But these athletes, how is their health compared to the general population? So that's the first question. The second question would be relevant to many more people. So many of you work in kinesiology, interested in community health. To the regular person, these are like Martians or even stranger. Who does this amount of physical activity? Most people do not. If you do much more than what is recommended, but not what these people do, you suffer adverse health events. So I tried to calculate, if you were someone who were doing one of these elite races and your training amount. So I calculated this in relation to typical marathon training. A marathon runner, elite marathon runner, might do an amount of physical activity that is 100 times what is recommended. But most people are not going to do 100 times. You might do 3 times, 2 times, 5 times, 10 times. What happens when you do these levels of activity that are higher than what is recommended, but isn't at the level of elite athlete? So let's look at the first question. What is the death rate among elite athletes compared to the normal population? So this was a study looking at Tour de France participants and compared the death rates of Tour de France participants with the general French population. So I'm going to walk you through this slide. These are people at different ages, and this is the line 1. So if you fall on the line 1, it means the Tour de France participants had the same death rates as the general French population. And again, if you look at it, you'll find that most of them, for most of the age groups, the dots are well below 1. So that athletes actually died at the lower rate than the French population. And again, we want to look at the confidence in your result. And for the one dot that is above 1, you see that this whisker is very, very wide, which implies that there were few participants in that group, and so you're not very confident in the statistical result that you obtain. So athletes, elite athletes, yeah, they may die while they're running, but they have a far lower death rate compared to the general population. And so what about the general population? You know, if you do activity levels higher than what's recommended, you die at a higher rate. Many of you may have heard in the last 2 months about a couple of studies that came out and all these headlines. So this is one of the headlines that I pulled up from the Telegraph in the UK. It says, "Fast running is as deadly as sitting on a couch, scientists find." So again, look at the data, don't look at the headlines. So where did this headline come from? It came from a study called the Copen City Heart Study. And what the study was they took 1,000 regular joggers and compared them with 4,000 what they call sedentary non-joggers. And let's concentrate on the bottom part for now. So they're actually the same study. This bottom part tried to adjust for differences in other health habits. And you see that the sedentary non-jogger was the reference. If you're a light jogger, and they define light, moderate, and strenuous jogger based on a combination of the speed and the frequency of your jogging. So strenuous joggers were people who ran for more than 2 hours a week, and the light and moderate joggers did less and at a slower pace. So if you're a light or a moderate jogger, you have lower rates of dying during follow-up compared to those who are sedentary. But if you're a strenuous jogger, your risk of dying during the follow-up period was higher than that of the sedentary non-jogger. So what to make of these data? So let's look a little bit more carefully at these data. So what I wanted to point out were 3 things that made me less confident in the result. The first thing is, remember, I told you to look at the whiskers. And this whisker is really wide. So this whisker is really wide. It tells you that you are 95% certain that this group of people could have as much as a 50% protection, or they could be as badly off as having 8.5 times the death rate. And that is such a wide interval, so you're not at all certain about the result. And why are you not certain about the result? That's because there were only 2 deaths in this category. So to talk about it in terms that might be more intuitive, if I were to take 2 coins and I'll flip them, and both of them say heads, is the second coin a loaded coin? Is this an unfair coin? I don't really know, because 2 isn't enough to tell me anything. If I flipped a coin and 2,000 times it came up heads, then you know that that's not a fair coin. But because there's only 2, you're not at all confident about your result. The second thing I wanted to point out is that the sedentary non-joggers, only 50% of them were men, and the strenuous joggers, 80% of them were men. Now, I said earlier when we talked about life expectancy, sorry guys, you die faster than the women. So because these are more men, the death rate could be higher simply because they're less women, right? And the third thing I wanted to point out is that the categorization of people were not entirely clear. So the sedentary non-joggers were not exactly inactive people. They included cyclists and walkers as well, who did less than 2 hours in those activities. So the headline that you saw, fast running is as deadly as sitting on a couch, maybe not. I don't think the data are that clear. There's another study, so this is only men. There's another study that came out last month also. It's called the Million Women Health Study, and it came out of England. So the Million Women Health Study enrolled more than 1 million women who came in for screening for breast cancer. They were between the ages of 50 and 64 years of age, and they were enrolled into a long-term health study. So the numbers at this time certainly are much larger, and it shows sort of the same pattern. So it asked about the frequency of, and I put that in inverted commas because it said strenuous exercise. Exercise, they explain, that causes you to sweat or to breathe hard. And you find that, this is actually heart disease, rates of heart disease go down as you do more strenuous exercise, and then it goes up again. And any exercise goes down as well, and then goes up again. So is it true that if you do more exercise, you're worse off, and maybe it's better to just do lower levels of exercise? Again, let's look at the data. So I looked at the data more closely, and I think there's something a little bit strange about the high category of people. So let's look on the left-hand side for the moment. So our problem actually is most people tend to do very little exercise. The people in this category were small, but still there were 1 million women, so there were a lot of events. So statistical fluke is not, chance is not an explanation for this. Let's look a little more closely at who these people are. So let's look at the percent smokers. As you might expect, the more exercise people do, the lower the rates of smoking are. And then when you come to this category, suddenly something unexpected happens. These people are actually smoking at a higher rate than any of the other groups. And if you look at the proportion of people in the low socioeconomic group, as you might expect, it goes down, and then suddenly it goes up again in this last group. So maybe this group of people are not the people who volitionally are strenuously exercising for their health. They may perhaps be people who are occupationally working at a high level. And because these may be people who are working occupationally at a high level, they might be the people who are exposed to factors such as stress that might contribute to their high rates of heart disease. And you see the same sort of pattern in this group, but maybe less marked. So this study doesn't entirely convince me that if you do high levels of physical activity, it's bad for you. So I'm going to show you a study that's going to be published in the next week or so. This is some data that have come out from a study that I collaborated with the National Cancer Institute. And what this study is, it pooled together 6 cohorts. So in total, we have something like 660,000 men and women who have been followed for 14 years, and there are more than 60,000 deaths in this group. So what you see, again, is men and women, and what we've tried to do is classify these individuals according to how much they do based on recommendations. So this is a classification in net hours per week, but let's not worry about that. All you need to know is 7.5 beds is about the level that meets recommendations. So if you're here, you do less than what's recommended. Here, you do what's recommended at the first level. Here, you do what's recommended at the second level. And you go all the way to 10 times what is recommended. And this focuses on leisure time physical activity. And I know I said that all kinds of activity count. And it is true that all kinds of activity count. But we didn't want this to be confounded by, for example, occupational heavy work where stress or environmental pollutions might confound the results that we have. So when we focus only on leisure time physical activity, you can see that as you expect, the smoking rate goes down steadily with the higher levels of physical activity. And we looked at mortality rates, so red for women, blue for guys, and you can see that it goes down steadily, and then it flattens out at about 3 to 4 times, and it never goes up. Among the men, you see this little uptick, but there's less than 1% of individuals in there, and if you look from a statistical standpoint, these 2 dots are not very different. So if we look at these data, I believe that up to 10 times what's recommended, you really don't see harm as far as mortality rates are concerned. And that, interestingly enough, if you go from doing nothing to doing a little bit, you get a lot of benefit. And you actually see most of the benefit at about 3 to 4 times what's recommended, and then it sort of tapers off. So to summarize, how much physical activity is too much? Our current guidelines say that there's a dose-response relationship. Do some, you're good. Do more, you're better off. But it also acknowledges that we don't know what the upper limit is. And personally, I believe that there must be some upper limit. You can't exercise to 1 million times what's recommended. At some level, I think harm will occur. what that level is not clear. Based on what we had, if you do even up to 10 times what's recommended, you still see no adverse effect. And what's very encouraging for a lot of people is that if you go from doing nothing to a little bit, you get a lot of benefit, and it sort of tapers off at about 3 to 4 times what's currently recommended. So I'm going to stop this and give you my conclusions. So over this last period of time, we've looked at what kills us in the US, and we find that chronic diseases kill us, particularly cardiovascular disease and cancer. What are some of the things that we can do about it? Physical activity is one of the things that you can do, and it is important on a worldwide basis. It's not smoking. We know that if we do physical activity at the level that is recommended, we get significant health benefits. What if we do less than what's recommended at a lower intensity? Studies are ongoing. We should be able to find our answers in the next period of time. What if you are very sedentary, even if you're physically active? Not clear. We should be able to find out next period of time from the same studies. And at the other end of the spectrum, can you do too much? Physiologically, it makes sense that there must be some level beyond which there is harm. But at least up to 10 times what is recommended, we do not see any harm as far as mortality rates are concerned, and that we see most of the benefit getting from nothing to doing a little bit, and sort of tapers off at 3 to 4 times what's currently recommended. So I'm going to close here and show you a photograph of the quadrangle of my medical school, taken last summer when there was green, no snow. I hope someday to be able to see that. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Dr. Lee. We really appreciate everything you've done for us today. I think we've had 3 outstanding sessions. Wanted to give you a gift from our school. This is a William Magnum print of Faust Hall.
Oh, lovely.
And I like the dogwood paper on it.
I know, flowers.
So thank you so much, and we've so enjoyed having you here today. Thank you. Here for a short time if you have some questions to talk to us, but we have to move out.